Soup sandwich.
Yep.
What's up, guys?
And we're going to learn something today. It's probably the first time that you'll have watched the Soup Sandwich podcast and learned something. But but it's going to be good. Viewer discretion is advised, obviously. If you have any traumatic experience with plane crashes or you just don't flat out don't want to watch it, don't.
Put your seats to upright position and
put your oxygen mask on.
Stow your baggage and get ready for a fucking story.
Helios Airways Flight 522, a flight scheduled to travel from Cyprus to Prague via Athens, was stuck on a loop 35,000 feet in the sky, and there had been no communication from the plane for over an hour. In a state of confusion, the Greek army sent 2 F-16 fighter jets to investigate, but as one of the pilots glanced a view inside the aircraft, they saw that disaster was about to unfold, because the pilots were nowhere to be seen. They were about to witness one of the worst airplane disasters in European history, and it left everyone on the ground with one question.
European history.
What happened to Helios Flight?
I guess there's been some real bad ones, huh?
The story of Helios Flight 522 began at 9 p.m. on Saturday the 13th of August 2005, when a Boeing 737 aircraft, nicknamed Olympia, departed London Heathrow for Larnaca, Cyprus. The plane was owned by Helios Airways, a low-cost Cypriot airline that chartered flights between Cyprus and the rest of Europe. The flight was initially fairly uneventful, but then the crew heard something strange. A loud banging noise was coming from one of the plane's doors. Upon further inspection, it also seemed that the seal around the door was frozen. Following procedure, one of the flight's crew members made a note of the incident in the aircraft cabin defect log, and when the plane landed at Larnaca Airport at 1:25 a.m. local time, those notes were passed to the captain for review, who personally spoke to the ground engineer team to ensure a full inspection was carried out. And with that, the crew left, and a full inspection began. The man in charge of the inspection was 44-year-old Alan Irwin, a well-liked and hands-on engineer from the UK who had been hired by Helios Airways on a 6-month contract. Following standard operating procedure for a Boeing 737, Alan carried out a cabin pressurization leak check to test the integrity of the door. To do this, he and his team needed to manually pressurize the plane while it was still on the ground. As part of that process, Alan switched something known as the pressurization mode selector located on the cockpit panel from auto to manual. It's important to remember that a plane's onboard pressurization system ensures that the plane is adequately oxygenated as it gains altitude. This is something that is always done automatically, but a manual option is available in order to perform on-the-ground tests. However, going through this process, Alan and the rest of his team were unable to recreate the problem, and so, after carrying on with other routine checks, he noted down that there were no known defects, no leaks, and no abnormal noises. Alan and the rest of his team felt that the onboard pressurization system was working just fine. This is the moment that starts off a chain of events that will seal the fate of everyone on board, because the pressurization mode selector had not been set back to auto. On Sunday the 14th of August 2005 at 3:15 a.m. local time, the aircraft was released for its 6 a.m. flight to Prague via Athens. Fast forward to 5 a.m, the crew for Flight 522 arrived an hour before departure to complete a standard pre-flight briefing. Due to staff sickness, there had been some difficulty in putting together a full crew. Luckily, 2 attendants, Luisa Volterra and Andreas Prodromou, were able to fill in last minute. Initially, Andreas was reluctant to join the crew, but would eventually agree after discovering that his girlfriend, also a flight attendant, was serving as a member of the cabin crew on that particular flight. The 4 flight attendants would join 59-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton and 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Haralambos, 2 experienced pilots with a
porno star.
1,000 hours of flying experience
Killer
between
mustache.
them. Together, this crew of 6 would serve 115 passengers.
He looks like the guy
around a
from
third of
Narcos,
whom
kinda.
were
Yeah.
children. As the cabin crew were preparing for takeoff, they knew that this would be an easy and short flight with experienced pilots. But what they didn't know is that Hans was fired 3 months earlier by British airline Jet 2 for repeated failures to comply with standard procedures. In fact, nobody knows this, not even Helios themselves, because Hans' references were never asked for. On top of this, First Officer Pampos also has a record of rushing through checklists, and to make matters worse, the two pilots don't exactly see eye to eye. In fact, Pampos had complained multiple times about Hans' attitude and was actively seeking new employment. Nonetheless, as passengers began to board the plane, Pampos and Hans worked through their standard pre-flight checklist. It is here that the string of catastrophic errors continued. Pre-flight checklists are lists of tasks that should be performed by pilots and aircrew prior to takeoff. In the cockpit, pilots will be working through multiple lists designed to ensure that all switches and indicators are in the correct positions. But Flight 522 was slightly behind schedule, and so, as both Hans and Pampos rushed through their checklists, they both failed to register that the pressurization mode selector was still on manual. At 6:07 a.m., 7 minutes behind schedule, the aircraft took off from Larnaca Airport. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. 4 minutes after takeoff, at 6:11 a.m., ground control cleared Flight 522 for a final cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, and the plane began its climb through the clear blue Cypriot sky. It should be said at this point that only the last few hours of in-flight cockpit recordings are actually available, and so much of this story has been pieced together using the in-flight data recorder, on-the-ground recordings, and testimony, as well as clues from the crash site. And what this all shows is that due to the pressurization mode selector still being set to manual, the cabin was not automatically pressurizing, meaning the air was getting thinner, and there was increasingly less oxygen. Even though multiple indicators on the cockpit dashboard clearly showed that the altitude inside the cabin was abnormally high, for some reason neither Hans nor Pampos, two pilots with tens of thousands of hours of flight experience between them, noticed. At 12,000 feet and climbing, yet another fatal and inexplicable error was made when a loud alarm started sounding in the cockpit. Because the pilots had missed the earlier signs that the cabin was not adequately pressurizing, they misread this loud alarm as an erroneous takeoff configuration warning. In other words, a glitch. This was, in fact, the cabin altitude warning alarm. While the two sound exactly the same, where the alarm sounds indicates which it is, and when it sounds off in the air, it means one thing and one thing only: that there is an immediate and urgent issue with the cabin pressurization, and that oxygen masks should be worn immediately. Neither Hans nor Pampos did this. Instead, at 6:14 a.m., Hans made a call down to the Helios dispatcher on the ground. At first he mentioned the erroneous takeoff configuration warning, which was sounding in the cockpit. This confused the dispatcher because a takeoff configuration alarm cannot sound at 12,000 feet in the air, and so he handed the call over to Alan Irwin, the on-duty ground engineer who had performed the plane's inspection earlier on in the day. But things became even stranger when the captain began to radio down about a ventilation cooling system error. He stated that, quote, the ventilation cooling fan lights were off. Then, moments later, he directly contradicted himself. To Alan, who was listening in on the ground, the conversation was as confusing as it was bizarre. But perhaps, Alan thought, Hans is confusing two lights that sit closely together, and it was at this point that he asked the captain about the pressurization mode selector, to which he received no reply. Alan didn't realise
They're all
at the time, but
hypoxic.
Hans was
Yeah,
behaving
the
strangely
oxygen, yeah.
because he and his co-pilot were both suffering from rapid onset hypoxia, a condition whereby the body is deprived of oxygen.
It was high as hell, huh?
Now they were
The effects of
in
hypoxia
onset
on the
dementia.
human body
Yeah.
are
Really.
strange. At first,
Right?
vision
Mhm.
worsens
That's what
slightly,
the symptoms
and
are,
then
right?
confusion and disorientation begin to set in, quickly followed by a lack of coordination, and then a mood change, which for some can be extreme irritability, and for some, euphoria. What is particularly terrifying about hypoxia is that one of the symptoms can be a disassociation from the self, meaning sometimes people cannot truly grasp what is happening to them. Because Hans and Pampos did not immediately put on their oxygen masks in response to the alarm, at 15,000 feet and climbing, these symptoms were coming on very quickly. And as they set in, a warning light, known as the master caution light, came on to indicate that masks had now dropped inside the passenger cabin. Those masks were able to distribute approximately 12 minutes of oxygen per person, more than enough for a plane to descend to a safe and breathable altitude. This was yet another warning that something was wrong with the cabin pressurization system. But it was too late. Both pilots were now too impaired to understand what was happening, and they were unable to work through the problem logically. Instead, both pilots got distracted by the equipment cooling light, which came on because the onboard computer systems were not being cooled properly due to the inadequate pressurization.
It's weird that all this shit sounds the
Both
same.
pilots chose to focus on in their increasingly
Like
hypoxic
the
state. Hans believed that it could be fixed by a system
alerts
reset.
and shit. You can't tell them
Down on the
apart.
ground, Alan, still baffled, continued to ask Hans about the pressurization mode selector. Hans ignored him and demanded to know where the circuit cooling breakers were, to which Alan replied, "Behind your seat." 13 minutes after the flight took off, at 6:20 a.m., the line went silent.
So,
Confused, but satisfied.
that's how
that
long
he
it
had answered
takes.
the captain's
Not
question.
long.
13 minutes from the time it took off and hypoxia because of the oxygen levels dropping as the air is getting thinner as you're getting up higher. Because they ended at 35,000 feet is what they said, right?
34,000, I think.
So it doesn't take but, I mean, shit. That doesn't take but 10 minutes to
It
get to
gets
that.
faster as you get higher too. So like as your altitude increases, hypoxia onsets.
Of course,
way,
but
way
I'm talking about
faster.
time in general. Like the actual
I
time.
think they were in the air for 13 minutes
Before they were out.
everybody was unconscious.
That's right.
Every single person on the plane.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Passengers inside the cabin would have only had a few minutes of oxygen left. We can never know what happened in that cabin, but we can reasonably assume that there would have been panic and confusion. Following procedure, the cabin crew would have been seated, waiting for the pilots to perform an emergency descent to a safe altitude. Instead, the plane was on autopilot and was continuing its climb to 34,000 feet.
So they're
All the while,
dead
The cabin crew
now.
had been aware
Nah.
that the masks
They're just
were fast running
unconscious.
out of oxygen
If they didn't get their
levels
oxygen
to
mask on,
at
they're dead.
6:29
I don't
p.m.,
think that the
Helios
oxygen
dispatcher
is so low that they die. There's enough oxygen for them to be able to stay alive, but just not conscious and knowing what's going on.
So this is how they think JFK Jr. died. Same way. Where his plane was just autopilot and everybody was dead on the thing.
And that crashed.
Yeah.
And it crashed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking
I was probably around the same fucking time.
about. Yeah. At 6:29, we've been in the air for 20 minutes, I guess.
who initially took the call from Hans, contacted ground control at nearby Nicosia Airport. He stated that he hadn't been able to make further contact with Flight 522 for 9 minutes. The dispatcher at Nicosia Airport also failed to reach the cockpit, and at 6:36 a.m., 16 minutes after last contact, Flight 522 began to enter Athens airspace and was handed over to Athenian Air Control. Over the next 40 minutes, the Air Control Center team at Athens and several planes in the vicinity...
It's kind of crazy what these planes can do because the plane's flying itself there.
Yes, it
The
is.
plane just
I
sat there.
literally was thinking, like, back then, is there some kind of dissension button that a person has to push? Because
Yeah.
you don't have to do that these days. I'm
No.
pretty sure it just flies right there. But does those fighter jets shoot that son of a bitch down over water to not have any
Kill everybody.
casualties on the ground? You know what I mean? Like, that has to be going through their head,
It has
right?
to be. Or I would imagine, like, if this was flying over New York City and half of the time it was flying over the ocean,
Yes.
you know,
that's what they do.
They would shoot that bitch down over the ocean.
At 7:20 a.m., Flight 522 began what looked like a standard
There's a
approach
rice
procedure.
shortage.
7:20. We've been up in the air for over an hour. We've been unconscious for an hour, actually.
Now they're dead.
In the same direction that it came, entering what is known as an automated holding pattern as part of its missed approach procedure over the Greek island of Kea. And it was here that Flight 522 stayed, flying around on a repeated loop. At this point, teams on the ground knew that something was desperately wrong. By 8:23 a.m., the emergency level
Another
was
hour.
elevated to alert. The Hellenic Air Force had been contacted, and 2 F-16 fighter aircraft were dispatched. Just 9 minutes later, At 8:32 a.m., the two F-16 pilots described the disaster that was about to unfold before everyone's eyes.
This makes me sick.
Teams on the ground listened in horror as they were told that First Officer
Fucking sissy.
Campos Haralambos was
Yeah.
slumped over.
You were
the
fucking
car.
9 when this happened too.
Martin Martin was nowhere to be seen. Later, they would find out that he had passed out, searching for the switch.
Or you were
behind his
8,
seat.
right?
No one
Yeah.
was flying that plane.
I was 8, yeah.
The
No
two
one was flying the
F-16
plane.
pilots went on to describe how all passengers were sat completely motionless, with their oxygen masks dangling uselessly above them.
So they never got them on.
I saw two passengers on the left side of the aircraft. They were sat motionless in their seats and were wearing oxygen masks on their faces.
Some of them did.
That's when I saw
So they
additional
passed out.
oxygen masks dangling from the passengers' overhead units. Even though the passenger cabin was dark, I could see the shadow of the oxygen hoses and masks against the daylight shining through the windows on the other side of the passenger cabin.
The emergency level was now set to the highest possible as rescue teams on the ground attempted to make sense of this horrifying new information. And then, at 8:49 a.m., during the plane's 10th holding pattern, the F-16 pilot observed someone slowly making their way to the cockpit. The person put on a pair of headphones and placed their hand on the controls in front of them. But just 1 minute later, the left engine stopped working due to fuel deprivation, and the plane, all of a sudden, began to rapidly descend. The following conversation is
So somebody's in there.
two
So
F-16
close.
pilots and the rescue teams on the ground. It's at this point that they realise that the person in the cockpit is Andreas Prodromou, one of the flight attendants who agreed to fill in for a sick colleague at the last moment. Andreas,
Earlier she said luckily.
find out, was a qualified pilot, and it appeared that he was controlling the plane, but he had no training on a Boeing 737, and the plane was now rapidly losing altitude at a rate of around 1,500 feet per minute. The F-16 pilot
That means it's fallen through the
tried to
air
make
like
visual
for like
contact,
20
but
minutes.
Andreas was not responding.
That's right,
Instead,
1,000 feet a
the
minute.
words, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Helios Airways Flight 522 was weakly spoken into the cockpit radio, which was set to the wrong frequency. These recordings would later be recovered from the crash site. But as the plane was going down, Andreas was speaking into the void.
Think rate. Think rate. Terrain. Pull up. Think rate. Think rate. Terrain. Pull up.
At 8:59 a.m., the right engine on the plane gave out. At this point, Andreas looked directly at the F-16 pilot, slowly lifted his hand, and weakly pointed downwards.
Τη στιγμή δείχνει ο άνθρωπος που κάθεται στο θάλαμο διακυβέρνησης ότι με βλέπει. Ελήφθη. Κάνω τα σήματα αναχέτησης, δεν ανταποκρίνεται, με οπτικό σήμα διαχειρός έδειξε ότι με βλέπει. Ελήφθη. Συνεχίζει τα περάστα 7.000 το αεροσκάφος. Ποστών αρνητικών στα 5.000 πόδια με πορεία 2.18.
The plane's descent was happening so quickly that the teams on the ground were struggling to keep up.
Το αεροσκάφος είναι στα 2.500 πόδια, πετάει πολύ χαμηλά πάνω από ξηρά. Πάμε 132, πόσο είναι?
Altitude. Altitude.
Πάμπο, αυτή τη στιγμή το αεροσκάφος δείχνει ότι πάει για το έδαφος.
Altitude.
Τύχη Μάμπο, το αεροσκάφος πάει προς το έδαφος. Ελήφθη. Αθήνα, το αεροσκάφος αυτή τη στιγμή πάει για το έδαφος.
Altitude.
100, 1, 3, 23 μίλια.
Altitude.
Mayday, Μάμπο, έχουμε πρόσκρουση πολιτικού αεροσκάφους. Έχουμε πρόσκρουση πολιτικού αεροσκάφους. Mayday. Ελήφθη. Σας αναφέρω συντεταγμένες, Μάμπο. Αναφέρω συντεταγμένες. Έχει προσκρούσει σε κορφή βονού. Mayday. Ελήφθη, αναμένετε συντεταγμένες.
Watermark.
At 9 hours, 3 minutes and 32 seconds, Flight 522 collided with the rolling hilly terrain just outside of Grammatico village at 400 miles per hour, causing a fireball that instantly razed several acres of land to the ground. All 121 people on board lost their lives instantly. Several were members of the same family. Some were couples who went on holiday, leaving their children with their parents. Reports would later show that most passengers were alive, but unconscious. After the wild speculation amongst the media subsided, a 186-page air accident investigation report was written. This report cited multiple failures to recognise the cabin pressurisation issues as they arose on the day, but they also revealed an ineffective and dangerous organisational culture that bent the rules.
So they were getting oxygen.
Yeah, a little bit.
Just only enough to stay alive.
I think it was because when it starts that automated holding pattern,
Yeah.
it descends some.
Right.
So like the altitude decreases, gives them a little bit more oxygen, which helped them, which is what made him wake up later.
Right.
But he was still the only one that woke up, and it's because he is training to be a pilot. So he's been in that situation before, you know, like he's been through that shit.
At least
before.
simulation
Yeah,
wise.
they simulate hypoxia and all of those
Yeah.
things. Like there, it's about to show you.
Okay.
In the absence of all but the last hour of the cockpit voice recorder, one question is often asked about Helios Flight 522. Why did the cabin crew not immediately enter the cockpit? And if they did, why did they not make contact with teams on the ground over the radio? This is especially puzzling considering that they had access to several hours of oxygen, as well as, clearly, the cockpit access code. Even the report itself states that it is rather puzzling. But perhaps the on-plane oxygen system can give us a clue. Because of the way the emergency oxygen system works on a plane, it's likely that the adult passengers would have run out of oxygen first. The crew had access to 4 emergency oxygen cylinders, and we know that 3 of them were used, but how and in what manner is unclear. Is it possible that some of the cabin crew may have attempted to share their masks with, say, one or several of the flight's younger passengers? If this did happen, this would have created an extremely dangerous situation, because at 34,000 feet, the effects of hypoxia set in at around 30 seconds, making the window for what is referred to as useful consciousness very short indeed. Perhaps,
Very
in order
fast.
to help other passengers, the crew inadvertently incapacitated themselves.
Trips me out to
Perhaps this
think
was
that
done
people
in
were
the time that
slowly
their own
waking up
masks ran out
as the plane
on
was
their way
going
to the
down
emergency
too.
oxygen cylinders. Or perhaps Andreas incapacitated himself, helping his partner. These are of course just theories, because ultimately we will never know. In 2007, several families of those who died in the crash sued Boeing for €76 million. The lawyer leading the case highlighted that having the same alarm in place for 2 different types of dysfunction, one relatively minor and the other with potentially devastating consequences, was negligent. All parties ended up settling out of court. And then, in 2008, 4 Helios officials, including Alan Irwin, were charged with manslaughter, and after a complicated legal battle with the Greek courts, were all eventually found guilty in April 2012. By 2013, however, Alan Irwin had successfully appealed. Other Helios officials were sentenced to 10 years, but were all ultimately able to pay their way out for €79,000. This is
Damn.
analysts
Nothing.
who feel that to this day, justice has not been served. Today, a memorial dedicated to the
$88,000.
victims has been
In
built
these
in
days, money.
Nashville.
Back then, it was probably more like
Stands as a
115,
reminder of the
120,000.
lives
Yeah.
lost in this
Because the euro is worth way more than.
Diminish over, especially in 2008.
Yeah, it's the pound has come closer too. It's
Yeah.
still higher, but it's come
Yeah.
closer. Hell, the euro is like a penny or 2 off.
Yeah, it's like $1.02.
Yeah, it's nothing.
So they changed the thing.
Boeing's been in a lot of trouble for a lot of shit like this. This
Yeah.
is not new.
Can you look up one more video for me? Like it's gonna take like 3 minutes. Why you should put your mask on first? Is what it's called. Yeah, right here.
If you'll drop your mask from the right-hand side, turn your regulator off.
This is what they're experiencing.
You can look at the surgeon's gloves. You can see that they are really experiencing gas expansion. How are you guys feeling inside the chamber as far as the gas goes? Feeling good. And so we're going to start start this hypoxia demonstration, whoever has the toy, if you want to use that for me. So what I'd like for you to do is to pick up a piece, hold it up, show everybody, and tell me what shape it is. It's a triangle. All right, so you're going to put it inside the box? Good. Okay. Next piece. Another triangle. Another triangle. Circle. Circle, no, it's a cylinder. It's a cylinder. Cross. Across. Square. Square. That's another cube. You've been off oxygen now for 2 minutes, by the way. Roger that. Don, how you doing over there? I'm starting to feel like I'm going the black and white and the Looney Tunes kind of thing. My vision is going into just a central spot. All right, so Don, you can go back on oxygen anytime you want to. You don't have to stay off. I'd like to know what the O2 saturation
Flip this shit right back on.
Yeah, did he?
Mm-hmm.
67. 67, okay, so that's a critical area here where you need to start thinking about getting back on oxygen, because once you get below 60, death can occur just like that, right? So you got to realize you don't want to die. Can we try the shape box one more time just to compare a difference between when you were just starting your demonstration versus right now? We can tell you're really starting to feel the effects of hypoxia. Triangle? Yeah, what I'm interested in is to see what kind of coordination he has now. Starting to tingle. Yeah, you've been off oxygen for about 3 minutes, 45 seconds. What is that? Square. And what was that one? That was a square? A square. Are you sure that's this one? You're starting to have a little shake there, you know, that lack of oxygen. You need to start thinking about getting back on oxygen now, Destin. What would you do? If you felt like you needed to get on oxygen, how would you correct for that? Can you correct for hypoxia for me?
So he's done.
If you don't get on oxygen, you're going to die, right? You're not going to be able to survive this. Go to your regulator, get all 3 switches up on your regulator. All right, go to your regulator, get all 3 switches on your regulator. All right, let's go ahead and put him on for him. Let's get him back on.
He couldn't even do it. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's fine. That's enough.
Interesting.
That's what they're experiencing.
Interesting.
And now, like, you can literally see him like come back to life as he gets oxygen so fast.
Yeah. You're saying as they're
ascending,
they're descending, they're coming back to life, and how big you are matters. So the smaller people are waking up faster.
Yeah.
So
because your body's moving the oxygen around.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh shit. Yeah.
Yeah, and your body's built up a tolerance.
So this is not like a conspiracy. This is just what happened.
That's what happened.
All of the knots, all of the guap, all of the pesos, all of the pollo, all of the knots, all of the guap, all of the pesos, all of the pollo, all of the money, all of the money, all of the money, all of the money.